Constructed languages are a topic dear to my heart as I am currently creating constructed languages, or conlangs, for some of my future written works. On this episode of the Heartland Author Podcast, I will offer advice on creating constructed languages for works of fiction. It has been a long time since I have done an episode of this podcast, but it is time for a new season and a new episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. Welcome to Season 2 of the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp, the host of the Heartland Author Podcast, an author and a soon-to-be poet. Today's episode is about constructed languages, or conlangs, which are human languages whose vocabulary, phonological features, grammatical features, and other linguistic features are constructed by one or more people instead of being developed naturally. Not counting revived natural languages as constructed languages, very few people on this planet speak a constructed language as a primary or secondary language. However, constructed languages have their roles in society, and one of them is their use in literary works of fiction. Some, but not all, works of fiction incorporate the use of constructed languages. Legendary fantasy author J.R.R. Tolkien has created numerous conlangs for his works, and the fantasy novel series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin incorporates the conlang Dothraki and the Valyrian conlang family. I am currently creating multiple constructed languages for some of my future written works, including a series of science fiction novels. To authors out there who are or are considering constructing conlangs for their works, here is some advice from me on constructing constructed languages. I will preface my advice by noting that there are two general categories of conlangs. The first is a priori, which means from the former in Latin and describes conlangs which are built from scratch with minimal or no influence from natural languages or other conlangs. The second is a posteriori, which means from the latter in Latin and describes conlangs which are heavily derived from existing languages. Artistic conlangs, which is what this podcast episode is primarily about, can be either a priori or a posteriori. My first word of advice is, even if you're building an a priori conlang, to take as much time as necessary to study the phonology, grammar, and other linguistic features of natural languages and other conlangs, as well as phonological, grammar, and other linguistic features that occur across many different languages. Y'all do not have to be world-class expert linguists to build conlangs, but it is pretty much impossible to build a conlang without any understanding of how linguistic features work. My second word of advice is, even if you're building an a posteriori conlang, to build your conlang from the ground up, starting with small-scale linguistic features like phonemes, then by building syllables, then by building words, then by building the conlang's grammar system. If y'all would not build a house from the roof down, then y'all shall not build a conlang from the top down. Building a conlang from the bottom up makes it easier to build a conlang with coherent phonological and grammatical rules. My third word of advice applies more so to those who are developing a writing system from scratch for their conlang as opposed to using or modifying an existing writing system for their conlang. My advice is, if you are creating a writing system for your conlang, to start developing the conlang with a writing system that you use for a language you speak regularly, then develop the writing system for your conlang later. If the writing system you are creating is phoneme-based, such as an alphabet or an abjad, develop the writing system after you develop your conlang's phonology. If the writing system you are creating is syllable-based or mora-based, develop the writing system after you develop your conlang's rules for permissible syllable constructions. If the writing system you are creating is a logographic writing system, develop the writing system after you develop your conlangs words. It is permissible to create an a priori conlang with either an a priori or an a posteriori writing system, and it is also permissible to create an a posteriori conlang with either an a posteriori or a priori writing system. While I am not an expert linguist, creating constructed languages is one of my favorite parts of world building for my fiction works, and I hope my advice is helpful to those who are creating conlangs or thinking about creating conlangs. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. My website can be found at https://authoraac.wixsite.com/site, and I can be found on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at authoraac. I can be reached via email at campaaronapollo@gmail.com, authoraac@outlook.com, or aaroncamp@mail.com. Copyright 2020 by Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of the audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode in any form without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except for reuse permitted by fair use guidelines under United States copyright law. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.